The Edinburg and Dore Lectures by Thomas Troward. Chapter 2. The higher mode of intelligence controls the lower. And before we get into Chapter 2, just to say a little bit more about Chapter 1 and this first initial concept that Troward is saying, when the elements of time and space are eliminated, all our ideas of things must necessarily be as subsisting in a universal here and an everlasting now. So, this is so important because it takes away the idea of loss or absence or separation or lack. Because whatever we can conceive of with our consciousness as an idea or a thought, if it exists as a thought, that means it exists in the spirit realm, which is eternal and forever. And if you can think something, then you have the ability to bring that thought back up in your mind anytime you want, and you have the ability to recreate that form anytime you want. So it's not like we can lose things if we understand this concept. So if we lose something, if it's just an idea, we can bring that idea up and that thing will be replaced or recreated. So it's a concept that seems very abstract, but it's very practical and very important. So say you lost your car in the material world. Something happened, it got stolen or whatever. Well, that's just matter. If you bring up the idea of car in your mind, a new car will come to you that will be maybe better than your last car, or at least equal to it. Because the idea always exists, and the idea is forever and eternal. So we don't care about the form. Forms can be recreated forever. And even people, if we lose a loved one, well, the idea of them exists forever in your consciousness and in your memory. And you can never lose your consciousness or your mind. So as long as they exist in your mind and in the mind of God, which is eternal, they can't ever go anywhere. They might disappear from the material world, but this is just a small blip in eternity. In the world of forever, of spirit, they always exist. So nothing is ever lost, because everything that's a thought or that can be remembered or that can be visioned or felt, it exists. And anything that ever existed always exists. You can't ever take away something that existed. It always will exist in the eternal here and now. It's just a good concept to think about and to really try and absorb that concept as we move on. Okay, so we're on Chapter 2. The higher mode of intelligence controls the lower. We have seen that the descent from personality, as we know it in ourselves, to matter, as we know it under what we call inanimate forms, is a gradual descent in the scale of intelligence, from that mode of being which is able to realize its own willpower as a capacity for originating new trains of causation, to that mode of being which is incapable of recognizing itself at all. The higher the grade of life, the higher the intelligence, from which it follows that the supreme principle of life must also be the ultimate principle of intelligence. This is clearly demonstrated by the grand natural order of the universe. In the light of modern science, the principle of evolution is familiar to us all, and the accurate adjustment existing between all parts of the cosmic scheme is too self-evident to need insisting upon. Every advance in science consists in discovering new subtleties of connection in this magnificent universal order, which already exists and only needs our recognition to bring it into practical use. If, then, the highest work of the greatest minds consists in nothing else than the recognition of an already existing order, there is no getting away from the conclusion that a paramount intelligence must be inherent in the life principle, which manifests itself as this order. And thus we see that there must be a great cosmic intelligence underlying the totality of things. The physical history of our planet shows us first an incandescent nebula dispersed over vast infinitudes of space. Later, this condenses into a central sun surrounded by a family of glowing planets, hardly yet consolidated from the plastic primordial matter. Then succeed untold millenniums of slow geological formation, an Earth peopled by the lowest forms of life, whether vegetable or animal, from which crude beginnings a majestic, unceasing, unhurried forward movement brings things, stage by stage, to the condition in which we now know them. Looking at this steady progression, it is clear that however we may conceive the nature of the evolutionary principle, it unerringly provides for the continual advance of the race. But it does this by creating such numbers of each kind that after allowing a wide margin for all possible accidents to individuals, the race shall still continue. So careful of the type it seems, so careless of the single life. In short, we may say that the cosmic intelligence works by a law of averages, which allows a wide margin for accident and failure to the individual. But the progress toward higher intelligence is always in the direction of narrowing down this margin of accident and taking the individual more and more out of the law of averages and substituting the law of individual selection. In ordinary scientific language, this is the survival of the fittest. The reproduction of fish is on a scale that would choke the sea with them if every individual survived. But the margin of destruction is correspondingly enormous, and thus the law of averages simply keeps up the normal proportion of the race. But at the other end of the scale, reproduction is by no means thus enormously in excess of survival. True, there is ample margin of accident and disease cutting off numbers of human beings before they have gone through the average duration of life. But still, it is on a very different scale from the premature destruction of hundreds of thousands as against the survival of one. It may therefore be taken as an established fact that in proportion as intelligence advances, the individual ceases to be subject to a mere law of averages and has a continually increasing power of controlling the conditions of his own survival. We see, therefore, that there is a marked distinction between the cosmic intelligence and the individual intelligence, and that the factor which differentiates the latter from the former is the presence of individual volition. Now, the business of mental science is to ascertain the relation of this individual power of volition to the great cosmic law which provides for the maintenance and advancement of the race. And the point to be carefully noted is that the power of individual volition is itself the outcome of the cosmic evolutionary principle at the point where it reaches its highest level. The effort of nature has always been upwards from the time when only the lowest forms of life peopled the globe, and it has now culminated in the production of a being with a mind capable of abstract reasoning and a brain fitted to be the physical instrument of such a mind. At this stage, the all-creating life principle reproduces itself in a form capable of recognizing the working of the evolutionary law. And the unity and continuity of purpose running through the whole progression until now indicates, beyond a doubt, that the place of such a being in the universal scheme must be to introduce the operation of that factor which, up to this point, has been conspicuous by its absence, the factor, namely, of intelligent individual volition. The evolution which has brought us up to this standpoint has worked by a cosmic law of averages. It has been a process in which the individual himself has not taken a conscious part. But because he is what he is, and leads the van of the evolutionary procession, if man is to evolve further, it can now only be by his own conscious cooperation with the law, which has brought him up to the standpoint where he is able to realize that such a law exists. His evolution in the future must be by conscious participation in the great work, and this can only be effected by his own individual intelligence and effort. It is a process of intelligent growth. No one else can grow for us. We must each grow for ourselves. And this intelligent growth consists in our increasing recognition of the universal law, which has brought us as far as we have yet got, and of our own individual relation to that law, based upon the fact that we ourselves are the most advanced product of it. It is a great maxim that nature obeys us precisely in proportion as we first obey nature. Let the electrician try to go counter to the principle of electricity, that electricity must always pass from a higher to a lower potential, and he will effect nothing. But let him submit in all things to this one fundamental law, and he can make whatever particular applications of electrical power he will. These considerations show us that what differentiates the higher from a lower degree of intelligence is the recognition of its own selfhood. And the more intelligent that recognition is, the greater will be the power. The lower degree of self-recognition is that which only realizes itself as an entity, separate from all other entities, as the ego distinguished from the non-ego. But the higher degree of self-recognition is that which, realizing its own spiritual nature, sees in all other forms, not so much the non-ego, or that which is not itself, as the alter ego, or that which is itself in a different mode of expression. Now, it is this higher degree of self-recognition that is the power by which the mental scientist produces his results. For this reason, it is imperative that he should clearly understand the difference between form and being, that the one is the mode of the relative, and the mark of subjection to conditions, and the other is the truth of the absolute, and is that which controls conditions. Now, this higher recognition of self as an individualization of pure spirit must, of necessity, control all modes of spirit which have not yet reached the same level of self-recognition. These lower modes of spirit are in bondage to the law of their own being, because they do not know the law, and therefore the individual who has attained to this knowledge can control them through that law. But to understand this, we must inquire a little further into the nature of spirit. I have already shown that the grand scale of adaptation and adjustment of all parts of the cosmic scheme to one another exhibits the presence somewhere of a marvelous intelligence underlying the whole. And the question is, where is this intelligence to be found? Ultimately, we can only conceive of it as inherent in some primordial substance, which is the root of all those grosser modes of matter which are known to us, whether visible to the physical eye, or necessarily inferred by science from their perceptible effects. It is that power which, in every species and in every individual, becomes that which that species or individual is. And thus we can only conceive of it as self-forming intelligence, inherent in the ultimate substance, of which each thing is a particular manifestation. that this primordial substance must be considered as self-forming by an inherent intelligence abiding in itself becomes evident from the fact that intelligence is the essential quality of spirit. And if we were to conceive of the primordial substance as something apart from spirit, then we should have to postulate some other power which is neither spirit nor matter, and originates both. But this is only putting the idea of a self-evolving power a step further back, and asserting the production of a lower grade of undifferentiated spirit by a higher, which is both a purely gratuitous assumption and a contradiction of any idea we can form of undifferentiated spirit at all. However far back, therefore, we may relegate the original starting point, we cannot avoid the conclusion that at that point spirit contains the primacy substance in itself, which brings us back to the common statement that it made everything out of nothing. We thus find two factors to the making of all things, spirit and nothing, and the addition of nothing to spirit leaves only spirit. From these considerations we see that the ultimate foundation of every form of matter is spirit, and hence that a universal intelligence subsists throughout nature, inherent in every one of its manifestations. But this cryptic intelligence does not belong to the particular form, excepting in the measure in which it is physically fitted for its concentration into self-recognizing individuality. It lies hidden in that primordial substance, of which the visible form is a grosser manifestation. This primordial substance is a philosophical necessity, and we can only picture it to ourselves as something infinitely finer than the atoms, which are themselves a philosophical inference of physical science. Still, for want of a better word, we may conveniently speak of this primary intelligence, inherent in the very substance of things, as the atomic intelligence. The term may perhaps be open to some objections, but it will serve our present purpose as distinguishing this mode of spirit's intelligence from that of the opposite pole, or individual intelligence. This distinction should be carefully noted, because it is by the response of the atomic intelligence to the individual intelligence that thought power is able to produce results on the material plane, as in the cure of disease by mental treatment, and the like. Intelligence manifests itself by responsiveness, and the whole action of the cosmic mind in bringing the evolutionary process from its first beginnings up to its present human stage is nothing else but a continual intelligent response to the demand which each stage in the progress has made for an adjustment between itself and its environment. Since then, we have recognized the presence of a universal intelligence permeating all things. We must also recognize a correspondent responsiveness hidden deep down in their nature and ready to be called into action when applied to. All mental treatment depends on this responsiveness of spirit in its lower degrees to higher degrees of itself. It is here that the difference between the mental scientist and the uninstructed person comes in. The former knows of this responsiveness and makes use of it, and the latter cannot use it because he does not know it. End of Lecture 2. And in synopsis of Lecture 2, we are now delving a little bit deeper, and we're talking about how the higher mode of intelligence controls the lower. So, since the beginning of time, it's been very apparent that there is a larger intelligence at work that has evolved humankind to the point that it's now at, which is the point of self-recognition. So that is the highest point that the spirit or the atomic intelligence can take us. And it's been said that spirit is the power that knows itself, right? So when we are at the point of intelligence that we recognize ourselves as spirit and as somebody who has volition, and that there is an atomic intelligence, and we become aware of this atomic intelligence, as he's calling it. You could call it God, you could call it spirit, anything like that. So when we come to the point of self-recognition, that we realize that we exist, that we have volition, that there's a higher intelligence in the universe that we can contact and it's responsive to us, that's as far as the natural progression can take us. And then it's up to us to use our intelligence to make conscious communication with the atomic intelligence and to manifest things in a conscientious way rather than by default. And Troward talks about the law of averages and the lower degrees of intelligence. So when we're first brought into this world, you know, in other books it's called race consciousness. Ernest Holmes refers to it as race consciousness. When we're first brought into this world, we're subject to the law of averages, and we're just sort of automatic. There's like a mass consciousness, and there's all kinds of things that can happen, accidents, disease, and we're all just sort of prone to this sort of randomness. It's like the law of averages, because we are under the law. We have to make intelligent use of the law in order to have control over conditions. But if we don't know about the law, then we can't make use of it. So until our intelligence has evolved to a point that we're conscious of the laws of the universe and the laws of nature, and we learn how to work in harmony with the laws of nature, then we're going to be subject to the law of averages until we evolve to that point. And the cosmic intelligence is no respecter of persons. It doesn't care about individuals. It makes a race, and it makes so many of them that no matter how many people get wiped out by the law of averages, the race will always continue. So it becomes up to the individual to come into conscious cooperation with these laws if one wishes to evolve and to express a greater degree of livingness and freedom. And when we become evolved, then we know how to use the law, and we're above the law, and we're free. But if we don't know how to use the law, then we're not free, and we're going to be held in bondage. So that's why mental science is so important. It's not something that happens automatically in your life. It has to be an act of conscious volition. And a note on volition. Volition means you have choice. You get to choose how your life is to be. You can have any kind of life you want. You can have a happy life, or you can have a miserable life. It's your choice. And you have the right to choose. That's your birthright. And a lot of people don't even know they have volition. So, the last thing I wanted to note here is that we have to know the difference between the atomic intelligence, which is God or spirit, the creative principle that created us, and it's also the law of the universe. And then there's individual intelligence, which has volition, and that's us. We are individual intelligence, and we can contact the atomic intelligence and it will work with us, because it's no respecter of persons. If we know how to use the law, if we know how to give mental treatments or prayers or affirmations, whatever you want to call it, and we know how to work with the universal forces, we can manifest our highest and best possible life, which is very exciting. So, we have to remember that this is an intelligence. The atomic intelligence permeates all space and all substance, and it makes things out of itself. It's a self-formulating intelligence, and it's responsive. So we have to remember it's responsive to our thought. And we will end our synopsis there. I look forward to lecture number 3.